Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and I am your host and sensei, Gary Michuta. It's great to be with you today, and we got some great stuff in store for you, as always. And let me ask the big question. Can man be God? Well, you know what? There's actually a lot of people out there that would say, yes, you can become God. New Agers, for example. They will say, well, you know, it's just a question of enlightenment. When you realize the divinity within you, then you could unleash all your godly powers and walk on water, do all sorts of interesting things, you know, that only God can do. Change reality with your mind. But they're not the only people. There are other groups like the Mormons who believe that when you die, you become exalted and you become a god or goddess who rules over, you know, another world or worlds, and you become a kind of God, small g, just like what they call God the Father does. So that's just a few of these kind of outlying, rather odd beliefs that, yes, you can become God. But did you know this? Did you know that the Catholic Church teaches that you can become God? Well, in a qualified sense. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this fascinating idea within Catholicism. And we're going to juxtapose that with these counterfeit ideas of what's called in the East theosis, or in the Latin West, deification. And to help us do that, Dr. Douglas Beaumont's going to come on the show on the other side of the break. We're going to talk about that. You know, how do we become God? And in what way do we become like God? So, you know, we're going to talk about theosis. We're going to talk about counterfeit beliefs. It's going to be a lot of fun. So it's something a little different, but it's important out there because, like I said, there's lots of groups out there that operate on, they have a kernel of truth, but then they distort it and ultimately destroy it. And unfortunately, a lot of people are pulled into these groups. So it's good to know exactly what the church teaches on it and all, you know, and how it differs from these groups. So that's what we're going to do on the other side of the break. That's going to be a ton of fun. I can't wait for Dr. Beaumont to come into the dojo. And as always, we have our Finding the Fallacy, which I think this week we're doing propaganda techniques exclusively. And today's propaganda technique is the misuse of relative terms. And we also meet one of the early church fathers, which today is Evagrius of Pontus. Evagrius of Pontus. And I always have to take a breath because sometimes these are not familiar names, folks. But nevertheless, they're important. You know, they left some great writings. So we're going to learn more about that early church father in a little bit. But first, we need to take care of a few things. For example, I want to say hello, everybody, and give a shout out to those watching live stream on social media, Facebook, YouTube. Hello, everybody. And thank you, by the way, for the beautiful explosion of emojis in the chat room there in YouTube, the YouTube section of the dojo. I also want to thank all of you listening on great Catholic radio and other Catholic radio, or excuse me, other radio stations, not only in the United States but abroad. Welcome aboard, everybody. And by the way, if you have a question for Dr. Beaumont, give us a call toll free at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. And I'd love to hear from you. Also, maybe you're too shy to jump on the phone and ask a question. Well, that's fine because we have you covered with the Dojo email box. You can always email your questions or whatever, you know, just explain what's going on. Maybe you're talking with a non-Catholic and just want to share things that have been helpful, things that have not been helpful. Maybe you have questions. Maybe you're not really sure where to find answers. Well, I would be glad to help you. All you have to do is send an email to questions@handsonapologetics.com. That's all one word, handsonapologetics.com. And it goes straight to the dojo mailbox. And I do answer all the emails. So it might take a little while. The sensei's been very busy lately. But nevertheless, I do try to answer every single email I receive, and sometimes I even do a dojo mailbox show. Also, by the way, some people have asked me, I'd love to have you come and do a parish talk. Talk about apologetics, bring the dojo to a conference nearby or a parish. And I don't really, plug this very much on my show, but I do parish talks and conferences and so on. For information, just go to my website, which is handsonapologetics, all one word.com, and just click on talks, and you'll get the information about how you can bring the dojo and the sensei to your parish. So it almost feels silly me saying that, but nevertheless, I do try to answer questions, and that is sometimes I get questions like that, like, how do we get you to come do a talk? Well, that's how you do it, folks. It's that easy. So without further ado, why don't we jump into our Finding the Fallacy for today, which is the propaganda technique of the misuse of relative terms. This one, I take very personal because you probably can't tell, even on live stream, but I'm a pretty tall guy. And so relative terms have always been a problem for me because I will ask for a description of somebody and they'll say, well, they're pretty tall. But to me, pretty tall means not that short because pretty much everybody is shorter than me. So, words like tall or short, they're relative. They don't really have meaning unless they're in reference to something or someone. Okay. For example, if they say, well, he's taller than you, well, then I know at least I have an idea what you mean by taller. So anyway, the misuse of relative terms is like that. It takes terms that really don't have any meaning in themselves unless you tie it to a particular thing. What are these terms? Well, like better or worse or lesser or bigger or more filling or less filling or greater freedom or less freedom. All these terms really don't have any meaning. Maybe you might remember television shows before they passed the law for truth in advertising. They used to make claims like, buy this product, it's 50% better. But they never told you what's it 50% better than, right? Or try this, it's less filling. Well, less filling than what? It doesn't have any, but these terms can have positive connotations, but they're meaningless unless they're tied to specific things. So just be aware of that this is a propaganda technique that people can use or misuse, rather, relatives terms to kind of manipulate the audience. So, it'd be like me saying, listen to Hands-On Apologetics, folks, it's 50% better. And actually, I personally believe it's 100% better. But that's just between you and me. All right, so why don't we move on to our Meet the Early Church Father for today. And the Early Church Father, like I said, is Evagrius of Pontus. That's kind of hard to say. Evagrius of Pontus. It came obviously from Pontus, the area of Pontus. He was ordained a lector by St. Basil the Great, which, by the way, we had as our Meet the Early Church Father yesterday. And also, he was ordained a deacon by St. Gregory of Nazianzus. In Jerusalem, he became acquainted with the Roman lady Melina. And in his self-imposed exile in the deserts of Egypt, he knew well Macarius, the Alexandrian, and Macarius the Egyptian, the latter also being known as Macarius the Great. So he practiced the ascetical life, living in the desert. Now, it's as Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers tells us, it's extremely unfortunate that of his very numerous works, he actually wrote quite a bit. Most of them have not survived, at least not in a perfect state of preservation. So the lost works is probably attributed to a large part to the condemnation of the Origenist or Origenism in 553 by the Fifth Ecumenical Council and Second Council of Constantinople, which is the Council of Constantinople. We catch glimpses of him in other writings, like from Maximus the Confessor and so on. So, he kind of got grouped together with the Origenist, and unfortunately a lot of their writings were destroyed. So we get little snippets of him, John Cassian and others. So what's interesting is, although very little of his works have survived in their original Greek, we do have some in Latin, Syriac, and Arabic, Ethiopian, and so on. There's just enough there, Jurgen says, to kind of whet your appetite for his many insights. And unfortunately, it also makes us regret that we don't have his works in their entirety. And, one of those things that has survived is a dogmatic letter that he wrote on the Most Blessed Trinity. And Jurgen says that this letter is not merely an anti-Arian letter or an anti-Pseudo-Machian letter. By the way, the anti-Arians basically would be against the Arians who believe that Jesus is a lesser God. And the other group is also denies the divinity of the Holy Spirit. But rather, it seems to be an excellent Trinitarian source, which dates near the end of the 4th century, perhaps around 83, 81, or soon after that. And it seems that he is aware of the writings of St. Gregory of Nazianzus, specifically his 5th theological oration. Now, I'll just read little snippets. It is pretty profound. Boy, do I have enough time? He says the heretics ought to be confessing that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, just as taught by the divine words and by those who better understanding of the Scriptures. To those who accuse us of the doctrine of 3 gods, it is stated that we confess one God, not in number, but in nature. But I hear the music, I have to stop the quote. But still, that's our early church father for today. Coming up on the other side of break, Douglas Beaumont.
Welcome to our January 11th, 2020 Spiritual Warfare Conference. Every year without fail, this is our most popular, well-attended event. This year's Spiritual Warfare Conference will host Adam Bly, a Catholic demonologist, and an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists, along with Dr. Luis Sandoval, a psychiatrist who's part of the Healing, Deliverance, and Exorcism team for the Diocese of Orange. These two gentlemen bring tons of experience and expertise in the area of spiritual warfare. This is going to be a high-information Catholic seminar. I'll be there as well, sharing some riveting stories on the diabolical and liberation found through Jesus Christ from my best-selling book, The Devil in the City of Angels. Mark your calendars, come and join us, and meet other radio hosts from Jesus 911. Contrary to popular belief, spiritual warfare is not demon-centered, it's Christ-centered. Come join us and learn how to armor up and fight the good fight of faith. Catholics, wake up. Don't hit the snooze button. Join us at St. Christopher Catholic Church, 629 South Glendora Avenue, West Covina, California, on January 11, 2020. See you then. Strength and honor in Jesus' name.
Sirach 11:24 says, "Do not say, I am self-sufficient. What harm can come to me now?" According to St. Catherine of Siena, presumption is like vermin burrowing at the root of the tree of our soul. If we do not uproot it with great care and humility, it will eventually destroy the soul. May God keep us from all presumption of mind and heart, and realize that we depend on Him for everything.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2727. 2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. And I kind of, it was cut short last break. I didn't get that last line in from Abragus of Pontus on the Holy Trinity, because you might be thinking, okay, well, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit's God. It's not three gods, but one God. Yeah, what's so profound about that? Well, I missed the last part of that quote. So let me give it to you before we get to our guest. It says, let it be stated that we confess one God, not in number, but in nature. For all that is said to be one numerically is not one absolutely, nor is it simple in nature. In the universally confessed, however, that God is simple and not composite. In other words, he says, we don't simply say that God is one, because there could be lots of things that are numerically one, but they could be comprised of parts. When we say that God is one, we mean not only numerically, but also by his nature. His nature is undivided. It's not composed of parts. He's utterly simple. And he says this is universally confessed by the church. So I just wanted to share that, because I'm telling about how profound it is. And I cut off the most profound thing of the quote. So there you have it. So let's talk about, since we're talking about divine Trinity, since we're talking about God, let's talk about the question, can man become God? And in my teaser at the beginning of the program, I had mentioned a number of groups. They say, yes, you can. New Agers say you can. Mormons say you can. And actually the Catholic Church does, but in a qualified sense. So to help us walk through that, we have Dr. Douglas Beaumont. Dr. Beaumont's author, professor, speaker, blogger. He's armchair philosopher and backseat theologian. He earned his Ph.D. in theology from Northwest University and M.A. in Christian apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary, where he taught Bible and religion for 10 years before he became Catholic. And he's also the author of Evangelical Exodus. So, Dr. Beaumont, welcome to the show.
Great to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a little while. We keep canceling and rescheduling, so I'm glad that God's providence has put us together today.
There you go.
So yeah, okay. There's lots of counterfeit Christianity out there that makes the claim that if you do this technique, you follow this Christ principle, or you'll be exalted and become a god and rule over other worlds. There's claims that you can become God, but I think a lot of Christians don't realize that that is also sort of part of Christian theology.
Yeah, the words you find in the church fathers and things like that, if you've already got this, I don't know which groups you mentioned, but it sounds like probably Word Faith and Mormonism and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. If you've already got their theology in mind, it's really easy to look back at some of the quotes of the church fathers, especially like Athanasius, and say, oh, well, see there, the early church taught that we could become God. And this is even in the Catechism. The Son of God became man, talking of the incarnation, so that we might become God. That's the Catechism, paragraph 460. So it would be really easy for somebody unfamiliar with Orthodox theology to look back at quotes like that, and you can see this sort of thing in St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas as well, and think, oh, wow, well, I guess the Mormons aren't that far off, but the actual theology behind those words is very different.
Yeah, very different indeed, because they, what they think is that you actually become the divinity. That you can do divine things. You can, you actually become or realize that you are actually the one God. Where in Catholic theology is very different. And I mentioned two terms, theosis and deification. So why don't we start there? What exactly is that?
Yeah, they're just different words from different languages that point to the same thing. Western theology typically speaks of deification. Eastern theology typically speaks of theosis. But essentially, the words mean becoming God. So yeah, it's there. We have to admit that. Yeah. That is what it says. But the idea of deification is fundamentally different than what you get in Mormonism or maybe like word faith theology and this kind of thing. Yeah. Where we need to remember that deity, that word, or even theos, what we get theology from, is just, these are very generic words for God. So this is not God's name. God is not God's name, to put it that way. When Moses asked God for his name, he didn't say Theos.
Right.
What he said was Yahweh. So there is a much more generic version of the word God, much in the way it is in English. We can talk about false gods or a rock god or, something like that. And other languages possess the same kind of usage. So, the Bible talks about angels as gods. It describes people as gods. It refers to false gods as gods. Yeah. So this is really like more of a center of worship. Divinity is not always tied to the attributes of the one true deity, the one true God, the creator, the infinite source of all being, and this sort of thing. That's not implied by the word necessarily. Those words can refer to other things that are nothing like the one true God. We just don't have the language to really communicate that clearly. And so when some of the Greek fathers and others write this way, their words get translated into the word God, and that can be very easy for us to see that and think, oh, well, there's only one thing I call God, so that must be what they mean, when in reality it's not.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so what would be the closest term where we say that we become godlike or something to that effect?
Yeah, I think that's a much better way to look at it. And if we back up to Scripture, I pulled up a couple verses here. The classic text on divinization or theosis is 2 Peter 1:4, where he says that God has granted to us his precious and very great promises, that through these you may escape from the corruption that is in the world because of passion. Okay, so far this is just a standard salvation passage. But then Peter goes on and says, and become partakers of the divine nature. And I think that really that whole phrase, partakers of the divine nature, that really is the definition of theosis or deification, that there's a partaking there. Scripture is 100% clear that there is only one true God, only one creator with the infinite attributes of Yahweh. But the shorthand for that is true God, one God, that sort of thing. So when we talk about becoming God, that word becoming doesn't mean that my nature is being exchanged for another nature. What it means is that I am partaking of those attributes in a way that a human being can.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's very important. But what a staggering thing for him to say too, that we become partakers of the divine nature. That's one of those verses that I think if you're just skimming through Scripture and you hit that bump, it's like, whoa, that's pretty incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, not the kind of verse you just want to drop on your parishioners and then walk away.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's why it's so attractive for these other groups, because it's kind of like one of those things that it's staggering, but a lot of people just kind of glance over.
Sure, and if you watch, the Benny Hinn's and the it's been a while since I've even looked into these guys. The Word Faith type teachers out there, the Kenneth Hagins, these sorts. You can find a myriad of sermons that they've done on YouTube where, they're up there just cackling and screaming about how we get to be God. And the way they unpack it is very clear that they think we actually become actual gods. And to go back to the church fathers or even to Scripture and say that that is what is implied is just completely false. Just to read some other verses, just to kind of help us understand 2 Peter 1:4. For example, 1 John 3:2, it says, Beloved, we are God's children. Now, it does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. Okay, so there's that resemblance. Ephesians, St. Paul says, know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So these passages suggest what Orthodox theologians refer to as a formula of exchange. The idea being that Jesus can take on human nature and humans can take on the nature of deity, but always and only to the extent that they are humans. So in the incarnation, we need to remember that Jesus is adding another nature to his person, such that what Jesus is now double, right? He has the complete nature of God on the one hand. He also has the complete nature of humanity on the other. That's not what happens for us. Okay, so Doug Beaumont, if I achieve theosis, I don't add on the nature of God to my person. Rather, my nature becomes closer to what God is like, but it does so in the way that a human does so. The Catholic way of saying this is that grace perfects nature. So when God performs a saving act on a person, he doesn't change what they are by nature, because then you'd have a destruction, right? So like some nature would go out of existence, and then a new creation, in the sense that there's now a new thing there that wasn't there before. Rather, new creation language is talking about the new way that my human nature is expressed in creation. And so as I take on, better and better, and I come closer and closer to an accurate image of God, then it becomes proper to use these kinds of words like divinization, theosis. All of these imply a process, sort of a heading toward. But the finite never becomes infinite. A thing with a human nature never becomes the infinite true God.
Yeah, and that is such an important point, because God redeems us not by kind of wiping out humanity as if it's some sort of mistake and then replacing it with a kind of a divinized humanity. Rather, like you said, grace builds on nature, and it dynamizes who we are, but it never, we never become other than human, right? We always remain
That's right.
human.
Yeah, it's always a participation in God's grace, and not a generation by nature. He doesn't make a brand new actual thing. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be salvation. It would just be destruction and recreation.
Yeah. So that's very different from like the heretical takes on it, like Mormonism, where you actually kind of become an exalted, godlike human that can reign over solar systems and other people and produce other gods, and
right.
It's almost like a change in nature, where with us we remain human, but we kind of participate and can do things that is maybe beyond what our fallen humanity could possibly do.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in Mormonism, they get God wrong and man wrong. So they have a God who they call Elohim, an individual named Elohim, who is what they call an exalted man. So Elohim started off a human being just like you and me, but then he was exalted by the God before him, and so he now has the planet Earth. He's now having spirit children with the Heavenly Mother. I don't know if they still teach that, but it's been taught in the past. And then these spirit babies inhabit bodies here on Earth, and this whole cycle repeats again. And so then that's how you get to Lorenzo Snow's couplet, as God once was, man can become, and vice versa. And that's not what Christianity teaches.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont about, can man become God? Well, we're giving the Christian take on that. Stay tuned, everybody.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He was kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to the Terry and Jesse show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. Mm-hmm. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show and the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Wow. Daniel, what a testimony. And I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning, and love is the end. And God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Dr. Douglas Beaumont about becoming God, the Catholic way or the Christian way, and how that differs from how other heretical sects may view it. And we're talking about theosis, the process of becoming more and more like God, but we never actually, our nature never changes. We never stop being a created, a created creature. I guess that's saying the same thing two different ways. But it's done through theosis or deification, which Dr. Beaumont, you mentioned participation. Maybe we can dive a little bit down into what do you mean when we say that we participate in the divine nature?
Yeah, sure. A couple of quotes to lead off here. Just to go back to Augustine and Aquinas, just to randomly pick two theologians from church history. St. Augustine says in his exposition on Psalm 50 that he, Yahweh, has called men gods that are deified of his grace, not born of his substance. So Augustine is very clear here that we're talking about an action of grace. It is an elevation of human nature. It is not a substitute with a brand new substance. He continues, we have been made gods, but this is the effect of grace adopting, not of nature generating. So when we refer to ourselves and other believers as children of God, sometimes you'll hear people say, when two dogs have a child, what is it? A dog. When two humans have a child, what is it? A human. So when God has a child, this is the sort of crazy word faith stuff that you hear. So Augustine makes it clear. Yeah. It's an effect of grace. It's not of nature. It's not of generating. God isn't making new gods. And he even says it again. Those that are made gods are made by his own grace, not born of his substance, that they should be the same as he. So Aquinas is just as clear in his commentary on the Ephesians. He said the human mind and will could never imagine, understand, or ask that God became man, and that man become God and a sharer in the divine nature. Okay. In his commentary on John, he says something similar. He loved them to the extent that they would be gods by their participation in grace. And that's why he says, I say you are gods in Psalm 82. So you see this over and over again. Aquinas, obviously, he is a lot more detail oriented. He makes sure in virtually every passage that he says something like that to qualify it with those terms so that there's no mistake. Some of the earlier theologians are a little more loose with their language, a little more flowery. And so we need to be careful about isolating those verses. When we're dealing with Orthodox theologians, because we know that this is the way the church has interpreted them, we really need to read that back into their language, the language of participation rather than replacement or substance.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of participation, so what does that mean? I think a good illustration is, and this has been used by a couple different theologians, I didn't make this up, is the idea of heating a frying pan in fire. So if you imagine you're out camping and you've got that iron skillet on the fire, the pan participates in fire in the sense that fire is heat by nature, and the pan receives heat and becomes hot. So if we see all of those, like you can imagine if the pan's on for a really long time and it turns red hot, now it even looks like fire, right? So it's participating in fire in a very literal sense. The pan is becoming fire because what is a fire? Well, a fire is heat, and now the pan is hot, and it has taken on the color of fire. In other words, it's taken on some of the attributes of fire, but only in the way that a pan can. So the pan doesn't become the source of heat. You take the pan off of the fire, it turns back into just a pan. It's no longer participating in fire. So by virtue of the language of analogy, which is a technical term in Aquinas and others, it is true that the pan is fire, because in the way that fire relates to its heat, the pan now relates to its heat. And so heat is equal, but fire and pan are not equal, and yet there's a ratio. Here, I'm trying to draw this in front of my camera. There's a ratio of the fire to its heat to the pan and its heat, and in that equation, we come up with the language of analogy where we can say that the pan is fire. And so the same kind of thing is going on here. To the degree that a human nature participates in the act of God, in the attributes and the activities of God, it becomes analogously proper to say that man becomes God. But we're never making a move from here to here where a human is now God by nature. It's always by participation, described by analogy.
Yeah, I love that analogy too, because the pan never becomes the fire, and the fire never becomes the pan, but the pan takes on certain attributes of the fire. It starts giving off heat, like you said, maybe even giving off light, which it by its own nature would never be able to do by itself. But by participating with the fire, it takes on these different attributes like the fire, but it never becomes the fire. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's a great illustration, and that can also be used with a number of things. I mean, God's relation to us is really always like that. I mean, our very existence is much like the heat of the pan. I have existence because God is holding me in existence right now. But God, by nature, is existence. He's not getting existence from somewhere else. So just like the fire is heat by nature, and it can send that heat into other objects, God is existence, and he can sort of send his existence into other things such that their relationship with him is one of existing. But the instant God turned that off, there would be nothing to receive it anymore. We would just go completely out of existence if God were to withdraw his hand, so to speak.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. And also, I think some people are uncomfortable with deification because they almost conceive God as like a greater human being. That the difference between man and God is really a matter of degrees. Like we're strong, but God is really, really, really strong. Or we're smart and God's really, really smart. And so to say that, we take on these divine attributes, it's like, oh, well, you're kind of transgressing into divine territory. But, ontologically, in terms of what we are as substances, there's a much greater difference rather than degrees, isn't there, between man and God?
Yeah, you can't really have degrees of infinity, right?
Right.
And this is where you get a lot of these funny things, clear back from Zeno up to William Lane Craig today, where he produces these hilarious illustrations of what would be true if you could actually count to infinity, infinity isn't on the number line. It's not a greatest anything. It's not even on the same level of being because it's infinite. It's not finite. It's a negation of finitude. And so no matter how high a number you get, there's a sense in which you never get any closer to infinity. And deification is the same way. I might go from X amount of knowledge to Y amount of knowledge over the course of my life, but as far as omniscience goes, it's not like if I just could learn a few more things, I would ever get there. God's omniscience puts him in a completely different kind of relationship to reality than mine. I am receiving knowledge from the outside. I'm getting images. I'm forming memories. God creates by giving existence to what is in his mind. So it's not as if he's looking out and learning things. It's not as if he's receiving information from the universe and it is somehow adjusting his intellect. He makes his knowledge exist. And so this, you bring up a great point when it comes to just getting God wrong. There's a problem just with our own minds, because we live in limited, finite reality, that everything we think of is limited and finite. I can't have an image of infinity. And so when I think of God's knowledge or his strength or his presence, all I can do is really apply my limited experience to that, but then blow it up really big, right?
Right. Yeah.
So when I picture his omnipresence, I picture like, well, God's over there and over there and over there, and that's not accurate. That's not actually what that means. But the kind of philosophically precise language that has to be used to accurately communicate what we mean when we say omnipresent, omniscient, infinite, it's just so unwieldy, and it requires so much philosophical baggage to begin with, that we just kind of have to use the shorthand. And to the degree that we think our words are accurately describing God's nature, his actual substance, that just opens up a whole world of problems. We need to realize that we can say true things about God, but what is actually pictured in our minds is never what really is.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that brings up what you mentioned earlier, the principle of analogy, that when we're talking about God, we're really talking about something that's on a higher level, but there nevertheless is still that an analogous connection between us and God.
Right. So the analogy is not one of mathematical proportion where say, 1 over 2 is to, 10 over 20. It's a complete distinction. And again, analogy is another one of those words that we use in so many different ways that too can be confused. So
that's true.
Just to go through basically, just some fun philosophy of language.
Okay.
You can have univocal terms, univocal, singular voice terms, where they mean exactly the same thing when they're used. So for example, Doug Beaumont is a human, Gary Mashuda is a human. I'm using human univocally there because what I mean by human is exactly the same in both sentences. On the other end of the spectrum, there's equivocal use of language, where we make something equal that really isn't. So in that case, it can just be maybe two words that sound the same, but really refer to two completely different things in reality. So for example, a tree has bark and a dog has bark. It's just by an accident of language that we use the same word there, but what tree bark is in reality and what a dog's bark is in reality are really completely different. There's no connection between them at all, really. So analogy sits in between, and what it says is that depending on the nature of the thing that we're talking about, it can be to that definition of a word the way that the other thing is to its definition, and that's where the analogy comes from.
Very good. Well, we're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont about the question, can man become God? Stay tuned, everybody.
We have an exciting story for you to listen to. The story of John Pridmore. John Pridmore was a hitman for the gangs in East London.
I met some guys who seemed to have everything that I thought would make you happy. So I started working for these people. So to my shame, I was involved in vicious crime of all sorts.
He collected debts for the gangs, and if people didn't pay their debts, it was his job to kill them.
And as I drove home that night, I thought, what have I become? That I could kill someone and not even care.
He was in the elevator on his way up to the 17th floor, and there was a 17-year-old young man in the elevator with him. Suddenly, this young man looked John right in the eye, and he said, "Jesus loves you."
And I said the first prayer I'd ever said. I said, up to now, all I've done is take from you, God. Now I want to give.
Within a year, by the grace of God, John was able to get out of the gang and be freed from this road to hell that he had been walking on. Go to Virgin Most Powerful YouTube channel and listen to this story today.
Jesus said in Luke 17, "When you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are unprofitable servants. We have only done our duty.' According to St. John of the Cross, God is pleased with the little deeds we do in secret. He takes more pleasure in these than in a multitude of grand works that we may do out of the desire to be seen by others. May God help us to do the things that please Him, and not just to appear great in the eyes of others.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We're talking about the question, can man become God? And the answer, by the way, is given by Dr. Douglas Beaumont, our guest, is yes, through theosis or deification. And, of course, you have to be careful how you qualify that. And right before the break, Doctor, we were talking about analogy, and you were talking about equivocation, where you have the same word used and it has the same meaning. And then there's equivocal. I'm sorry, unequivocal, and then equivocal.
Right. So univocal is when
That's it.
It's the same words and the same meaning. Equivocal is the same words but different meaning.
Yeah, and that's where all the jokes come from, right?
Right.
I haven't had a bite to eat in a week, and so I bit him. That type of thing.
Exactly.
So, and then, but then there's this analogy that I'm sorry. Right before the break, the music came up. Where how does analogy work?
Right. So with analogy, what we're doing is we're saying that something's nature can be related to a word or some description. In the same way that another thing can be related to another word. So I think an example is probably easiest here. If I refer to a good knife, most people would realize instantly that I'm talking about something sharp. Sharpness is a thing that's good for a knife. If I'm talking about a good shoe, nobody thinks I'm talking about sharpness, right? They think comfort.
Right.
So
yeah.
The word good, what does it mean? I mean, when I say a knife is good, I'm not saying it's comfortable. And when I say a shoe is good, I'm not saying it's sharp. So how can I use the same word to refer to two completely different things in reality? Well, it's because of analogy. So what analogy says is, well, these words aren't univocal because the word good is not picking out the same thing in reality. They're not equivocal, though, because we don't mean good in completely different ways like we do bite or bark. So there's something in between. And that thing in between is saying that because of what a knife is by nature, it is related to goodness in a certain way when it's sharp. And in the same way, a shoe, because of what it is by nature, can be related to goodness in a certain way when it's comfortable. And so the goodness of the knife is analogous to the goodness of the shoe. Right. So what we might say is that in an analogy, the logical definition of the word is different, but the logical definition of the word good in this case would be the same, because goodness can be defined in a way that it makes sense out of the knife's goodness and the shoe's goodness. But the ontological definition is different because one is referring to sharpness and one is referring to comfort. And so I can use the word good of a knife and a shoe in an analogous way. And Aquinas says that when we speak of God, we're doing the same thing, because God's existence is what gives existence to all things. And so there is this analogy of being, that there is something about everything in existence that is analogous because they all exist. So there's at least that. Right. But the kinds of things that exist and the way their existence is expressed, if you will, has to be different because the natures are different. And so when I say God is good and this pizza is good, I'm not being equivocal. I'm not using good in a completely different way, the way I would if I said dogs bark and trees bark. And I'm not being univocal because God is not good in the way a pizza is good. But rather analogous. It is proper to use that limited word that I learned from pizza to speak of God, as long as I realize that when I apply it to God, I am no longer talking ontologically about the kind of goodness a pizza has. So that's what analogy is. And Aquinas will actually say that everything we say about God is analogous. We never really truly know him in our minds because we're finite, our thoughts are finite, he's infinite. And there's no way to bridge that gap. So where the bridge in language comes from, the reason that we know language can speak accurately of God is that when we apply the logic of analogy to God, it works. And so to bring all this back to deification and theosis, when we say man can become God and we realize, okay, become there is not an ontological change. It's not one substance to another. This is a participation, kind of like the pan participates in the heat of the fire. Well, then we realize we've got an analogy set up here. So to say that man can become God is like saying the pan can become fire. The reason the pan can become fire is because fire is heat by nature, and the pan can participate in that heat in the way pans can be heated. In the same way, man can become God, who is perfect existence, omniscience, omnipotence, all those great attributes. But it's only a participation in the way that a human can participate in those kinds of attributes.
Yeah, very good. So it's limited. We remain the same, yet we're take on something that ordinarily we wouldn't have. You know, it's like the pan having attributes that it ordinarily wouldn't have. How does the theosis occur? Is it any time God gives us grace, or is it particular sacraments that theosis is greater, perhaps, than in other areas?
Well, in some respect, theosis really just is salvation. And I think this is another reason why, you know, when maybe as a Protestant, I read some of these words, it was quite a bit more shocking, you know, to my theological sensibilities than as a Catholic. But because Catholics see salvation itself as a process, where, you know, where we are now is at one end, and what we will be glorified in heaven is another thing at the end of the process. Then if we realize that deification, theosis, that kind of salvation, or maybe sanctification is something that's probably a better term that Catholics could use with Protestants, because most Protestants understand sanctification, saint making, as a process with a beginning and an end. It's not an immediate, it's not that single point of justification that the Protestant will talk about. Catholics tend to use all the language of salvation in a process sense. So justification is a process, sanctification is a process, glorification is a process. So is theosis or deification. It's the process of becoming like God. So to whatever extent we are going to be godlike in heaven as glorified, resurrected beings, any step that we take toward that through God's grace is part of that process of deification or theosis. It doesn't necessarily imply that the journey is at an end.
Yeah, very
so
good.
As far as,
go ahead. I was just going to say, I was wondering, as an evangelical, how did you read verses like, you know, Peter, where he says that we partake of the divine nature, or when Jesus says, does it not say you are gods?
Yeah, you know, a lot of my early theological formation was really learning how to answer cults. I did it kind of backwards. For some reason, I just had a really good time studying false religion and figuring out why it was wrong. So I usually didn't really get introduced to those kinds of verses from an evangelical context, other than to say this is what they're not. I don't know that I ever heard a sermon based on any of these kinds of verses. And if I did, it was typically like, okay, now hold on, you know, here's all the things this doesn't mean, you know, and whether or not it ever got to what it really actually means, to be honest, in 25 years, I don't remember ever really hearing anything. But I can guess theologically, as an evangelical that believed that, you know, that there were different parts to salvation and that at least one of them was a process, then I would have probably just mapped that on to sanctification, as I just explained.
Yeah. You know, another thing, too, that I've noticed with a lot of evangelicals is that they don't understand the purpose of sanctification. They believe in sanctification. They believe you ought to be sanctified, become more and more holy, be conformed to the image of Christ. But ultimately, why? To what end? Often, evangelicals are kind of stumped on that, well, God commands us to be holy. But deification kind of provides that answer, doesn't it?
Yeah, because, in heaven, heaven isn't just like this, Islamic paradise with, virgins feeding you grapes. Heaven is not a place of wonder and happiness of any form, such that however we are when we die, we're just going to be completely happy. And what I like to tell people is, think about the things that make you happy right now, or at least that you think make you happy. How many of those are going to be in heaven? With the beatific vision, what do we get? We get an infinite amount of God. That's what we get. And all the goodness and all the love and everything that God is what we get. That's what we get an infinite amount of, lasts forever. To the degree that we don't want that, to the degree that we want things that will not be in heaven, that's really kind of a reduction of happiness in a sense. This is kind of a crude way to put it. But if I have to have, chocolate chip cookies to be happy, and there aren't any chocolate chip cookies in heaven, well, then that part of me either has to go, in purgatory perhaps, or I just don't get that part. So, for the beatific vision to be truly infinite goodness and joy forever, that's only going to be activated by the godlike parts of us that find joy and goodness in true goodness. If I only find it in limited, finite things, and I'm continually choosing, smaller, limited goods over the infinite good, that becomes a huge problem. And so what sanctification does, it's really preparing me for heaven. It's preparing me for the kind of bliss that I can have with God, but that I will miss out on if I require these limited, finite goods to be happy.
Yeah, it's kind of a foretaste of heaven in a way, because in a way we're getting a little closer to heaven because we're becoming more and more like God.
That's right. Yeah. So when we get an infinite amount of God, we want to be able to receive that and enjoy it as much as possible.
Yeah. And another beautiful thing too, just to tie it in, is that principle of analogy, because God created all things, and like you said, there is a kind of analogous, pointing towards God and things that are good, true, beautiful, just. In a way, those things are kind of giving us a foretaste of heaven. So I know one time Billy Graham was asked the question, will my dog be in heaven? And he said, everything you love about that dog will be there in God. I thought that was probably the best answer you could give.
That's pretty profound. Yeah. There's no way for us to think about heaven in other than finite terms, and I think this is where, you see the book of Revelation and things like that, he's describing it as, gates, giant gates that are made of a pearl, and, roads paved with gold and all that. But even that stuff would get pretty boring after a while.
That's true.
So we really, truly can't imagine what heaven is going to be like, because it's going to be infinite. We can't even fathom infinite, unending joy that never runs out, that never gets old, that we never get tired of. Everything on earth, the happiness factor always reduces over time.
Yeah, very good. Well, I hear the music coming up. So, Dr. Beaumont, thank you so much for coming on this show.
Thanks for having me. Always great.
All right. That's Dr. Douglas Beaumont. Go to douglasbeaumont.com. Check out all the great writings and material he has right there. Coming up next, we have High Impact Catholic Talk with the Terry and Jesse Show. And tomorrow, we have Master Apologist William Albrecht coming on. We're going to talk about, does God forbid alcohol? So it's going to be a very interesting subject as well. Time for me to shut down the dojo lights here, turn off the Midwest Command Center. God bless everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church, so I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.